personal and collective identity question of the Adeni Jew occupied the community's members when they were in Aden and afterwards, when they left there for Israel and London. The main question he asked himself is he special compared to his Yemeni brothers? Is it justified to see the Adeni Jewish community as a separate community? Already at this point I can say that there's no one answer to that matter, and it's also very difficult to prove one side or the other. Who can define this identity? Each person decides for himself, or the objective outside observer. Of course, I'm not an expert in this scientific field of identity. It is a sociological and philosophical issue, but I try here to put the historical facts in order and play a double role for a few minutes. Talk about my personal identity as a member of the community. Among the speakers, there are about 1.5 Adenis, Jewish Adenis. Yes? I'm one of them. And observe the community from the outside as a researcher. As we know, a person's identity is not determined only by the answer on the question of who he is, but also, and perhaps mainly, who he is not. That is, he built his identity relative to others. It is simple to discuss the Adeni community and its separate identity on the background of the British occupation. The occupation created real borders between Aden and its surroundings, the other communities of Yemen. Nevertheless, it seems that historically the Jews of Aden and perhaps all the inhabitants of the city had special characteristics already in the Middle Ages. From the 10th to 13th century, and we saw it today, we find letters addressed from the people of Aden to the communities of Egypt and Babylon, and to Maimonides, to his sons. Aden is mentioned in the manuscripts of the Cairo Geniza more than any other city in Yemen. The letters testify to a community that thrived both culturally and economically, and to the fact that its leaders are the leaders of all the Jews of Yemen. A more anecdotal example is the cemetery of Aden. In the ancient cemetery of Aden, there were tombstones. There were two tombstones with an epitaph from the 12th century and perhaps before. This is an example for the ancient ones, and this is newer. This is a phenomenon that is unparalleled in all Yemeni communities, and it seems to be an example of a deeper social process, perhaps for a Jewish cultural connection with other communities. To this should be added the city's strategic position on the world trade routes, which of course affected the city's population and its character. The descriptions of the Jews of Aden written by travelers from Europe before the British occupation are dual. Some describe the Jews of Aden in a special way from the other Yemeni Jews, such as the famous description of roasted. You can see here, you can see plates, spoon, knives, forks. In the person, they are usually tall, the children are very fair, etc. But on the other hand, Pickering wrote in 1848 that the Adeni Jews seemed to him to be more primitive than what he saw elsewhere. In the description of Europe travelers from the end of 19th century, we can see that there is already difference between the Jews of Aden and other Jews in Yemen, such as the descriptions of Malzahn, Banco, and Shlomo Reiner. The question of identity always fluctuates between the self concept and the observer from outside. Both are completely objective data. Another scale, another spectrum is between personal identity and collective identity. On the one hand, the Adeni man or woman defines to himself his identity and acts according to it. He decides, for example, where he lives, what his ambitions are, and who he will marry. On the other hand, the collective identity strengthens his sense of belonging to a community and distinguishes him from other communities. As I said, there's no doubt that the sense of differentiation intensifies with the British occupation at the beginning of 1839. The British developed Aden and all its inhabitants enjoyed welfare conditions and modernization that gradually increased in the beginning of the 20th century. Running water, electricity, telegraph, hospitals with Western medicine, a modern port, education with general subjects, extensive option of trading, and more. The identification of its inhabitants with the British Crown and the royal dynasty begins already with education in Jewish school. They sing the British national anthem every day, they salute the king. All these made Aden in many respects a separate political entity. But the Jewish community had its own deep currents. And we need to examine the question not only in the external effects, but in the processes that occur inside the community. Here I'll mention some aspects of the culture of the Aden Jew in the first half of the 20th century. Finally, I conclude with my point of view. Some things are more well-known, others less, but I'll introduce them quickly in the time I have left. Let's start with what the Jews of Aden say about themselves. Rabbi Moshe Hanoch Halevi, this is a picture of his son, also called Moshe Hanoch Halevi, who came to Aden probably from Turkey in 1850, lived in Aden for about 40 years until he moved to Jerusalem. He made efforts to distribute Jewish holy books within Yemen and publish books himself. Here he defining himself in my land, the land of Yemen. And in other book, he called himself resident of the city of Aden. Another famous personality who lived in Aden is Rabbi Shmuel Yosef Yeshua, who in the book he wrote, presented himself as an Adeni from the edge of Yemen. In the book, we can clearly see that towards people coming from outside, he calls himself we, the Yemenis. But in a neutral writing, he calls the people who came from the outside of Aden, they came from the interior of Yemen. This, of course, can also refer to northern or western or border city. And in his eyes, everything is considered interior of Yemen. In the middle of the 20th century, it seems that we are already witnessing the end of the separation process. Rabbi Yaakov bin Zili, who lived in Aden in the 20th century, arrived to Israel about 1950 and died about 30 years later, published a book called Hakitzu Ve'Raninu, and he writes here, this is one example, our brothers, the Jews of Yemen, yes, our brothers. Okay? Or everybody, Yemenis and Adenis. Yemenis are not Adenis, Adenis are not Yemenis. Now, observing from the outside. Of course, it's impossible not to differentiate between people from Aden and people from Yemen. We are surrounded here with pictures, so you can see it. This is what Jews from Aden looked like at the end of the 19th century, but in the beginning of the 20th century, the clothing changed a little. The tarbush, yes, or badla, the suit, and the kamis or galbia replaced the kufya and hikza. There is no kufya and hikza. The simon, yes, side locks were cut. But some people are still seen in the traditional clothing and appearance. The men in beards, kamis and mandil, the women wrapped from head to toe or in full head covering. But roughly from the 1930s, many of Adeni Jews got used to more modern clothes. And of course, there's also in the middle situation, this is yet traditional clothing. See? This is you can see the father, more traditional clothing, but his daughter less. And of course, afterwards, very normal fashions. Many of the community members live in relatively high economic level. And of course, the leader family stands out, Menachem Mesha family, who had trading connection all over the world, Europe, Far East, and made sure to develop the community in many ways. One of the most prominent actions is the establishment of girls' schools. Of course, this is very special in Yemen. Besides the usual religious activity around Mi'ilama, synagogue, and religious ceremonies, there were social gatherings in modern or Western style, which was not acceptable at all in other Yemeni communities. For example, mixed activities for men and women, theater with the scenery, clubs were established for social games, singing, piano, violin, reading newspapers, listening radio, watching movies, and more. Aden was also base of Zionist activities, such as the establishment of youth movements, collecting donations for the Jewish National Fund. A branch of Jewish agency was established in Aden, and through it, Jews all over Yemen were organized to immigrate to Israel. Another important point was the meeting of the Adeni Jews with refugees who came from Yemen for the purpose of earning a living or on the migration route to Israel. There were periods then when their number reached thousands. Usually they arrived with nothing, and the residents of Aden called them guests. Okay? There were few Yemenis who integrated into the Aden community, started families and lived in the houses of the Jewish quarter. Other Yemenis came along without the families to work in Aden as porters, servants, and other tough jobs. Many of them slept on the streets of the city, and when the number grew, Menachem Mesha families built BeTamar, a special shelter with the minimal conditions. The phenomenon created class differences. It caused, on the one hand, acts of kindness by the Adeni Jews, and the other hand, to arrogance and contempt. In any case, this triggered the local Adeni to intensify the sense of difference between him and the refugees. Another aspect in the relationship is the relationship with the surrounding Muslims. Under British rule, there was no official law that gave priority to Muslim over a Jew. The Jews enjoyed religious freedom and some equal rights. Why there were riots and so on, but between these events, the Jews testify to good neighborly relations, mutual respect, and cooperation in business. An interesting example of Muslim influence on Jewish culture in Aden is that many melodies, especially of the wedding songs, were borrowed from Muslim songs and dressed on songs from the Diwan. In Hebrew or Arabic. We heard about Abdul Wahab in other communities, but in Aden, it's very, in Yemen, in all Yemen, it's very rare. Singers like Ahmad Ibn al-Ka'tabi or Ahmad Awad al-Garash were known to Jewish Aden in the 1930s, and their songs dressed on Jewish songs. Now I'll state some facts that show a different picture. Another important element in Adeni Jewish culture is the tradition of using the Hebrew language. Hebrew was not spoken language about 17,000 years until the beginning of the 20th century. During this period, the Jews all over the world continued to read the Jewish sacred literature in Hebrew, usually loudly. Every Jewish child, usually the boys, learned to read long text in Hebrew from the Bible and rabbinic literature, as well as poems and other books from the Middle Ages. Every Jewish community in the world has developed its own Hebrew accent and way of reading. The Yemeni Jews has a special Hebrew accent that is unlike any accent otherwise outside of Yemen. The Jews of Aden have preserved a Yemenite accent of Hebrew in all aspects. From this point of view, they are an inseparable part of Yemen. Moreover, regarding to Jewish religious life, the Jews of Aden kept ancient customs that were used in Yemen hundreds of years ago. Sometimes they maintain Yemenite customs that have already ceased. For example, among the Jews of Sana'a, who are considered much conservative. I mean, for example, the version of prayer, customs related to holidays and family events such as wedding, reading the Torah. Some customs, as far as I know, were preserved only in Aden and nowhere else in Yemen. In general, in this respect, they are not different from other communities in Yemen. They all have a certain degree of conservatism, and at the same time, they were open to changes and outside influences. Okay, the conclusion. So what is the key according to which the identity of the Adenite Jew is determined? From the examples I brought, you can see a clear distinction between the holy world and the secular world. Everything relating to the secular world, the day-of-day life, the leisure culture, is different from what we are familiar with in the rest of Yemen. It reminds us of more westernized culture, or pre-state Israeli culture, or other Oriental communities that have gone through process of modernization. But the sacred culture, the traditional Hebrew culture, is Yemenite in every way. It is no different on its composition from other Yemeni communities, which ranges from conservatism to innovation. Each ethnic chooses to emphasize one of the sides, but no one is at the one end of the spectrum. Today I realize that I knew this idea all along. When I would ask my grandfather and grandmother the same question, I would get opposite answers. Grandfather told me, we are like Yemenis, there is no difference, you can get a lot better in Yemenite synagogue than in any other synagogue. But grandma told me, well, we are different, not the same, we are the British rule, we are modern. Thank you, they lived happily in the same house for 7 years until their last day. Thank you very much. Okay.